Tonight's presentation, Unaffordable, Unavailable. A presenter, Mike Bush. Mike is president of Savvy Aviation Incorporated, author for numerous aviation publications, been doing webinars with us since we started doing this, it seems like 2010, 2011 timeframe. Mike's a CFI, he's an A&P mechanic with IA privileges. 2008, he's FAA's Aviation Maintenance Technician of the Year and a member of EAA. Mike, thanks a lot for being with us tonight. I'm turning control the presentation over to you.
Well, very good. Good evening, Tim. Good evening, everybody. First webinar since AirVenture, and I think I'm pretty much recovered, but it was a busy AirVenture, wonderful weather. I did 14 presentations in 6 days, and and flew back to California in 1 day. So it was pretty busy, but it was a really wonderful experience. Weather was cooperative and the crowds were large and everything was great. Tonight's webinar is going to be a relatively short one, so there'll be lots of time for Q&A afterwards. Sometimes my webinars run close to 100 slides. This one's only 37 slides, but I'll be ad-libbing along the way. But I wanted to talk about some of the problems we have of keeping our aircraft airworthy in a world where it's hard to get parts, sometimes impossible to get replacement parts that we need for maintenance. The thought for this was triggered recently by a client of mine who had an older Cessna 182 Skylane airplane, very dear to my heart because my first airplane was a 1968 182. I think his is older than that. He was having problems with his nose gear. The nose oleo strut was leaking fluid and was going flat frequently, even then they would recharge it. And it turned out upon inspection that the reason that the nose gear was going flat all the time was that the piston part of the oleo, the chrome plated piston, had become badly pitted and corroded, and the corrosion pits were tearing up the seals every time the strut extended and compressed. And it was pretty clear that this piston was going to have to get replaced, the piston part of the oleo strut. So the shop that was maintaining this airplane checked with the Textron Aviation parts system and found that indeed they did have a replacement strut for this old Cessna 182. They had one in stock, but they were extremely proud of this part because the price of it was $9,200. That was sort of a staggering price for this part, and it was about 10% of the total airplane's fair market value. So it seemed an awful lot to be spending on an oleo strut. And this is a pretty common experience that parts that have to be changed frequently because they're wear components, they tend to have more reasonable prices, if you can use the word reasonable in the same sentence as aviation part. But parts that don't require replacement very often, if they are available, tend to have astronomical prices. Seems like an inversion of the principle of supply and demand, but parts that don't get used very often have very shockingly high prices, and this oleo strut did. So the normal thing that we do in a case like this would be to go see if we can get a part from a salvage yard. And I've bought a lot of salvage yards parts and keeping my airplanes going, and they're wonderful resources. Dawson Aircraft Parts and Salvage is probably the largest salvage yard that specializes in Cessna parts. BAS Parts and Sales, that photograph is one of the rows of shelving in the BAS parts office in Greeley, Colorado. I've bought a lot of parts from them. There's Texas Air Salvage, there's Air Salvage of Dallas, both in Texas, of course. And another shop, another salvage yard I've used a lot because they have a lot of twin Cessna parts is a company called Preferred Air Parts in Kidron, Ohio. And last year, Preferred Air Parts acquired KRN Aviation down in Arizona that I used a lot. So that increased the inventory of parts that Preferred Air Parts has. So these are all excellent resources for finding parts that are typically offered in what's called as removed condition. They're taken off of an airplane that's parted out or that crashed and is and the wreckage was decided. The insurance companies decided to part out the wreckage. And frequently these no strut pistons are available from these salvage yards with prices between $2,500 and $3,500. Still pretty expensive, but a third of what Textron wanted for a new one. So this would be useful. But unfortunately, we diligently searched all these places and we couldn't find one of these pistons in stock at any of them. They come and go, and but we couldn't find any at any of the salvage yards we checked, and we checked pretty carefully. We even looked on eBay. I've bought quite a few airplane parts on eBay, particularly electronics stuff, and it's also a pretty good resource. But there wasn't anything available on eBay either. So at this point, we either had to ante up the $10,000 to Textron, which was more than the owner really wanted to pay for this no strut, or we had to figure out some way of repairing his old one. So we started looking around to see if there was somebody that was FAA approved to re-chrome these oleo struts. And turns out that there is at least one place that does that. It was a outfit called Delta Strut. Used to be in California near Stockton, and they were acquired by a company in Michigan, in Kingsford, Michigan, and so Delta Strut wound up moving from California to Michigan, but they're still in business. They mostly specialize in repairing beach landing gear parts, but they sometimes will do Cessnas and Pipers. So we got them to re-chrome this 182 strut, and the cost was several $1,000s to do that, but it was a whole lot less expensive than buying the new part from Textron. But in Textron's defense, at least they did have a part in stock, even though the price was ridiculous. It still was available, and more we're running into situations where parts aren't available at any price, and it's making these aircraft harder and harder to keep airworthy when the part supply dries up. And we will jokingly refer to these parts as being made of unobtainium. The no strut wasn't made of unobtainium. It was obtainable, was only dollars away from a solution. But I ran into an unobtainium problem recently on my airplane, and it had to do with a Garmin GPS Map 696 that I have on my yoke and have had for decades. It's an older Garmin portable that they no longer support, but it's a really nice unit, and I have it hooked into my aircraft power, and I have it interfaced with my my 530 panel mounted GPS navigator, so that when I put a flight plan in on the 530, it automatically gets sent to the 696, so I don't have to enter the flight plan twice. And it's connected with a power data cable. It's a 4-conductor cable. Two conductors carry the power to the unit, and the other 2 conductors carry the basically RS-232 data that interfaces with the 530 on the panel. Now, I also have an iPad mini that I use in the airplane, and the iPad mini interfaces via Wi-Fi with my Stratus ADS-B receiver and with my Apereo ADS-B out transponder. And the iPad mini, where I run ForeFlight and where I can see ADS-B traffic that's picked up by the Stratus unit and sent to the iPad mini for display. And I can get the TISB weather on the iPad mini. On the Garmin 696, I get XM weather, which actually is a richer weather stream, and I prefer it to the TISB. It's nice to have both, but I think the XM weather is better, and it's got more weather products than you can get off of TISB. And it also provides XM audio, so I can listen to music in the airplane. And it also contains the AOPA airport directory, so that I can look up things about FBOs and what their frequencies are and stuff like that. So it's very nice to have both of them. I really didn't want to have to give up the 696, but the problem I had was that the 696 was starting to intermittently lose aircraft power, and the problem turned out to be in this power data cable that connects the 696 to the airplane. And these power data cables have not been available for years. And I did a diligent internet search, and you can't find them anywhere. You can't even find them in Europe or any place. It's amazing how you can search nowadays online and find things in obscure places, but this cable just was not available anywhere. Nobody had one. And I was able to isolate the problem to being inside the 4-pin plug, which is a molded plastic plug. If it was in the middle of the cable, it would have been easy. I could just cut out the bad section and splice it together, but it wasn't. It was right at the plug, and this plug is molded, and there was no way of getting in to repair it without destroying it. It was a real problem. So I was going to have to either replace the cable or at least find a replacement plug I could put on. And Garmin doesn't offer any of this stuff anymore, and nobody had anything in stock. So, I got the part number of the cable, but it just weren't any place. So, and apparently nobody's had these cables for years. So this was one of these unobtainium deals. So, getting desperate, I wondered if I could somehow find a compatible plug somewhere. And I looked at this thing. It's a little round plug, a 4-pin connector. And it looked to me kind of reminiscent of DIN connectors that we used to use a lot in the audio business. DIN is a German standard, and these round DIN connectors were pretty popular, back in the 60s and 70s. And I thought maybe this was a DIN connector, and maybe I could find one online. So I went online to my favorite electronics distributor, DigiKey, that has a really wonderful website, and I was able to find a 4-pin DIN connector that was the right diameter and so on. But when I looked at the pictures, it was pretty clear that the pin layout was not the same as what it was on the Garmin unit. So this DIN connector was not going to work, even though it looked similar. It wasn't the same, and it wasn't going to be compatible. I hunted around a little bit more on the DigiKey website, and I finally came up with a different little round connector from a California company called Kaikon. And studying the specs and the pictures and all the measurements and everything, it sure looked an awful lot like it might fit. Now, it wasn't a right angle connector, it was a straight connector, but at this point I was willing to get any kind of connector that would fit the 696. So it looked like it might be, and it was only $5. So I ordered one on speculation and figured, what do I have to lose? Maybe it would work. So a couple days later, it shows up. I opened the package. I expected to see a connector. What I saw was a construction kit for a connector. It was just amazing. This thing had eight different little parts to it, all very tiny. And apparently there was supposed to be some way of assembling all these parts to make a connector. But there weren't any instructions packed with it. It was just all these little parts. So the first thing I did was I took the little thing with the pins on it, little tiny plastic thing with 4 pins, and plugged it into the 696, and it fit. The pin pattern was the same. So that was good news. And then I found another thing in the kit that looked like it was the barrel, and I tried fitting that into the 696, and it seemed to fit too. So I was pretty sure that this connector was compatible with the 696. If I could figure out some way to put it together, that it was probably going to provide a solution. Of course, there were no instructions packed with the kit. So I went back to the internet and started Googling around and found a YouTube video from Kaikon that was like a little animation showing how all these parts were supposed to fit together. And so the next challenge was soldering wires to this tiny little 4-pin plastic thingy that there were little solder cups on the back of each of the pins. And this thing was so tiny that I had to solder it under magnification. And the trick was to apply enough heat to melt the solder, but not enough heat to melt the plastic. This turned out to be a bit of a challenge, and so I ruined the first connector very, very quickly. And but at least at this point, I knew that this connector would fit the radio. So I went back to DigiKey and I ordered 2 more connectors, and they arrived 2 days later. I tried soldering the second one and I managed to destroy it, but I was getting better at this, and the third time was the charm. I actually managed to solder 4 wires to this little connector without melting anything, and tried to follow the video instructions to put all the other parts together, which was non-trivial, but eventually I got it done. And I was able to create a little dongle with this connector on the end with a piece of 4-wire cable. And I bench tested it with a 696, and it worked. The powered up the 696, and I could see data coming out of it. So I chopped off the half of the original cable that was connected to the airplane. It was coming out of the panel, and I spliced this new dongle to it and tried to neaten everything up, and the thing worked. So problem was solved. Then I had a funny thought. I said, you know, what if I was like a normal aircraft owner who wasn't an ANPIA and didn't do all his own maintenance? And I had this problem with an intermittent 696, and I took it to an avionics shop. What do you suppose they would do? You think that they would have gone through everything I just went through to try to find this connector and solder up a cable and everything like that? It just seems very, very unlikely. It was extremely time consuming and labor intensive, and the project, I mean, took me better part of 2 weeks before everything was together and working and in the airplane. So my guess is if I went to an avionics shop, they would have said, well, that 696 is an old boat anchor, you might as well get rid of it. And they would have tried to sell me a Garmin's latest and greatest portable that, and then in order to get the XM audio and XM weather, I would have had to also buy a GDL 51 XM receiver and interface it with a 760. So with all of that stuff plus the labor to wire it all into the airplane, it probably would have been $3,000 or $4,000 to get the functionality back, instead of a $5 connector and a whole lot of work to get it to work. But at any rate, it just, this is not unusual. Keeping a 45-year-old airplane with 20-year-old avionics can be a challenge. And my poor 182 client had an airplane that was more than 45 years old. But this is the kind of thing that we have to deal with, trying to keep these airplanes airworthy. You have to get really creative about parts. Like I said, salvage yards are a really good resource. eBay is a really good resource. And for electronic stuff, there are some great electronics distributors with really excellent websites. But it takes a lot of work to do the research to find the stuff that you need. And this is the sort of thing that aircraft owners can really help with, and not expect that their maintenance shops are going to take the time to do all the legwork required to locate these parts. So Tim, that's all I have for tonight. It was a pretty short one, but we can open it up for some Q&A. Sure, everybody's got parts problems.
Oh yeah, do we ever? So let's see here. Gordon wonders, can you discuss owner-produced parts? For example, 3D scanning and specifying to a machine shop.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about owner-produced parts. So owner-produced parts it's an interesting aspect of the regulations. The FAA recognizes that that sometimes parts need to be fabricated because they're no longer available, and if they didn't allow something like that, some of our airplanes would be on the ground and never be able to fly again. So they've empowered aircraft owners to produce their own parts for their own airplanes. They're not allowed to sell them. They're only allowed to produce parts for their own airplane. And so the question arose, well, you know, what exactly does it mean for an owner to produce a part? Does he have to, make it in his basement on his lathe with his own two hands, or what does owner produced mean? So some years ago, the FAA came out with a legal interpretation that basically said a part would be considered owner produced if the owner did any of the following. I think it was 5 things on the list. I don't have it in front of me, but basically, if the owner provided specifications for the part, if the owner provided the materials from which the part was being made, if the owner supervised the manufacture of the part, there was a list of things. That basically, if the owner had some meaningful involvement in the creation of the part, it would be considered an owner-produced part. So it means that owner could go get a machine shop to make something for him, or it wasn't something he had to make with his own 2 hands in order to be owner-produced. The problem with owner-produced parts is that most of the time it requires, at least on certificated aircraft, it requires an A&P to install the part. And the A&P is not going to install a part unless the A&P is convinced it's an airworthy part. And the usual way that he knows it's an airworthy part is because it came with some paperwork that that said either it was an OEM part or a PMA approved part or something. But of course, an owner produced part doesn't come with any paperwork. So the owner's challenge on an owner produced part is to persuade the mechanic who he wants to install a part that the part is airworthy. And the best way to do that is to enlist the mechanic in the project to begin with and make him your co-conspirator in producing the part. Because if the mechanic is involved in the production of the part, there's a much higher likelihood that the mechanic will consider it airworthy, because he'll know what efforts were made to make sure that the part has the same fit, form, and function as the part it replaces, and was reverse engineered correctly if that's what was necessary, or it was made to the proper specifications if the specifications are still available. So that's the challenge with owner-produced parts is to convince the installing mechanic that the part is airworthy, and the best way to do that is to not present him with an owner-produced part, but to get him involved in the production of the part so that he has some sort of commitment that the part indeed is an airworthy part. I actually have one owner-produced part on my airplane that we put on years ago. We needed an oil line to feed the turbocharger, and Cessna wanted some ridiculous amount of money for it. I was prepared to spend the money, but the mechanic that I was working with, this is back before I was an A&P, said, we can make one of those. So we went out, we got some stainless steel tubing and, cut it and flared it and did all the right things and made it, and we logged it as an owner-produced oil line. And in this case, the whole idea of producing it was the mechanic, so he was definitely going to sign it off once we made it and put it on the airplane. Well, it wasn't a problem, but that's the best way to deal with owner-produced parts is to get your mechanic involved with the production of the part, so he's invested in it.
So just a clarification from Edwin, then he wonders, so it's the A&P's discretion whether an owner-produced part can be used?
Well, I don't think I'd phrase it exactly that way. It's always the A&P's discretion whether he is willing to install a part and sign off the aircraft as being airworthy, or sign off the work that he's doing as being airworthy. So the mechanic has to. This isn't only owner-produced parts. It's any sort of parts that don't come with paperwork. If you get part from a salvage yard, you sort of have a similar problem. But the mechanic has to be satisfied that that the part is airworthy, meaning it complies with the aircraft's type design and is in condition for safe operation. So, this is true of any replacement part that doesn't come with, FAA paperwork and 8130-3 airworthiness approval tag or something like that, or isn't an OEM part or doesn't have PMA markings on it. The mechanic has to be convinced that the part is airworthy before he'll install it. And so that's a problem, like I say, with any undocumented part, and an owner-produced part is almost by definition an undocumented part.
Bob was wondering, would the Skylane owner could have taken his pitted landing gear to a quote-unquote regular chrome shop to be repaired under owner-produced parts?
Well, he could have, but the question is, how would he then convince his mechanic that it was okay to install it? The piston in an oleo is a very close tolerance part. It has to be exactly the right diameter and so on. So again, it's just the problem of how are you going to convince the mechanic that this is legit. Mechanics really want some good basis for believing that the part is airworthy, and so it's it would probably make mechanic uncomfortable if the work was not done by somebody that was FAA approved to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And every mechanic is different and has a different tolerance for this, but mechanics tend to be quite risk averse, and so they always, if you ask them to do something, they in their mind they say, well, gee, what if I'm hauled in to a deposition and I'm asked by some hostile lawyer, why did you do that? I need to have a good answer.
Mm-hmm. So Daniel asks, when you source parts that are not made for aviation, what are requirements for the certified aircraft?
Well, I mean, if you're referring to the Kaikon connector that I used, I was not particularly concerned about that because this was a cable to a portable unit that was not. It's not a certified box. Doesn't have to be a certified box because it's not attached to or installed in the airplane in the sense that the regulations talk about. It's not considered an appliance. It's considered a portable electronic device, a PED, which is not certified. So the connector didn't have to be certified. If this was going into a piece of certified equipment, then it would have to. I would have to be able to show that it complied with all the applicable certification requirements, flammability testing and all the stuff that the FAA requires of certified equipment. So it would have been a lot more of a problem if this was a cable that was connected to a piece of installed equipment in the aircraft that had to be certified. In this case, it was something that attached to a PED. So I wasn't really worried about it, about any regulations. The oleo strut is a whole different ballgame. It definitely has to comply with all applicable regulations.
So James was wondering, is there a requirement to somehow qualify used parts for use in certified aircraft, like forms or documentation, or is the seller's word good enough? Thinking about like purchasing from eBay.
Well, the seller's word is worthless. He definitely doesn't help. You know, the the part. I mean, if you buy a part off of eBay, and it you know has a part number stamped into it or something, where you can you can determine that it was a part made by the OEM or a part that was made under a PMA. Then you should be good. The fact that it doesn't come with paperwork isn't necessarily an obstacle if you can show in some other way that the part came from a legitimate source, meaning either the OEM or somebody with a PMA that was authorized to manufacture the part. If the part doesn't have markings on it, and an awful lot of our aircraft parts have markings and part numbers and serial numbers stamped into them and stuff. I mean, I got a replacement nose wheel for my Cessna 310 from BAS, and it didn't come with any paperwork, but the nose wheel halves had part numbers and serial numbers stamped into them, so I was pretty sure that they originally came from Cessna and they were the right part numbers, so that was good enough. If it's a part that doesn't have markings on it, then it's more problematic.
Mm-hmm. Like James's question, I'm having trouble locating a correct alternator for a 1965 PA 28140. The one on it is an old roundback Chrysler style, and it isn't made any longer. How do I figure out what part number will fit on the 0320 E3D in the plane?
Well, I mean, it should be pretty easy to find an alternator that fits an 0320. If it's not identical to the one that was there, then you're making an alteration. But then the next question is it a minor alteration that an A&P can just sign off with a logbook entry, or is it a major alteration that requires approved data and a 337 and all of that stuff? And if the alternator has basically the same form, fit, and function, and fits the 0320 and has the same current output, and will run with the same regulator and all that stuff, then obviously it's the installing mechanic's call. But if it were me that was doing it, I would say that's a minor alteration, and I could just sign it off with a logbook entry, and that would be that. We wouldn't have to get the FAA involved.
David says, so I'm okay with sourcing parts via salvage yards, but my A&P has a big hang up about it and will only accept new old stock or SVC tagged parts. Sometimes those types of parts literally don't exist, and it's only AR. I'm not sure what he means by AR. Only AR. How do I handle that
As
tension?
removed.
As removed. How do I handle that tension between the mechanic?
Well, you probably can't. If you run into a situation like that, you're probably going to have to find a different mechanic whose butt muscles are clenched a little less tightly than the mechanic you're talking about. And frequently shops that are Part 145 repair stations are much more constrained in terms of what parts they're allowed to install on an airplane than an A&P who is either working independently or is working for a shop that is not a Part 145 repair station. Because some Part 145 repair stations frequently have traceability requirements that are imposed on them by the FAA, but A&Ps that are working outside the scope of a Part 145 repair station, there really aren't any such requirements. some mechanics are just more concerned about liability and stuff, which is like a big problem that we have in maintenance. I don't think they should do that, but it's something we see a lot among A&Ps that they don't want to do anything, that they consider to be at all questionable, if you want to call it that. But you're probably not going to be able to change your mechanic's mind if you're in a situation where you need to install a salvage yard part and your mechanic's not willing to do it. You probably need to find another mechanic who is willing to do it.
Robert wonders, when you get parts from a salvage yard that has "as removed" with them, is it still airworthy, he wonders?
Well, it certainly can be airworthy. I mean, the only issue is that if the part comes with, say, an airworthiness approval tag, an 8130-3, then whoever supplied the part with that airworthiness approval tag is taking responsibility for the airworthiness of the part. If the part comes without an 8130, then it's the person who installs the part that is taking responsibility for its airworthiness. And that's that's simply a question of how broad the installing mechanic's comfort zone is. I mean, if say I have an alternator that's got a diode that blew out, I can send it to an FAA approved alternator repair shop, which there are quite a few of, and they'll repair it and they'll send it back to me with an 8130-3. So they're now taking responsibility for the airworthiness of the part. I don't have to even think about that. I just take it out of the box and install it. On the other hand, I could take my alternator down to George's alternator shop down the street, who's basically an automotive alternator place, and I could stand around while he replaced the bad diode, and then I could put the repaired alternator back in the airplane, and it's perfectly legal to do that. But then I would be taking responsibility for the airworthiness of the part, which I would be personally happy to do, because I sat around there, I watched George, I knew exactly what he did. It looks like he did good work, so I would be fine with it. I'm talking about me as an A&P right now, because it's a little ambiguous, because I'm also the aircraft owner, but not every mechanic has as liberal an attitude about these things as I do. And also mechanics, they think a little differently when they're working on somebody else's airplane than when if they were working on their own airplane. It's just human nature. Because if I'm working on my own airplane, something goes wrong, I know I'm not going to sue myself. But if I'm working on somebody else's airplane, something goes wrong, then there's a possibility that the widow might bring a lawsuit against me. So mechanics who are working in shops tend to be a little bit more liability conscious about this stuff. But it's not a question of regulation. It's a question of the mechanic's comfort zone.
Kent was wondering, do these owner-produced parts or salvage yard parts have an impact on value for future sale of the aircraft?
No, I don't. I can't imagine that they do.
And Merrick wonders, what are your thoughts or experience with the new FAA VARMA program?
I have absolutely no idea what that stands for. So
it's a new thing that came out 2 years ago. I know we did a webinar on it. Our government advocacy folks worked with somebody in aircraft certification.
Oh, that's the vintage aircraft thing. Okay.
Vintage
I,
aircraft repair.
yeah. I know what you're talking about. I just didn't. I'd never heard it collapsed into an acronym like
The acronym is
VARMA.
VARMA, Varma, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm aware of a fairly lengthy advisory circular that the FAA put out on that subject that basically talks about permissible substitutions and it gives guidance on things like that for vintage aircraft, which is all a good thing.
Hmm.
But you know, I think that advisory circular was designed just to make mechanics a little bit more comfortable so that they would have something to point at. But you know, basically, the 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 requirement is that that the airplane has to be airworthy, and so the parts that you put on it have to be airworthy. And airworthy simply means it complies with the type design and is conditioned for safe operation. So it doesn't say, you know, it has to come from the manufacturer. But if it doesn't come from the manufacturer or it doesn't come from somebody who holds a PMA, then you're responsible for proving that it complies with the type design. And how are you going to do that? Well, certainly if it does, if you can show that it came from the original manufacturer or a PMA holder because it has markings on it or something that even though you don't have paperwork, but you know that this was, you know, this came off of a wrecked Cessna 182, so it's a legitimate Cessna part. Then you're pretty much home free because it's an OEM part. If it's not like that, if so, let's say it's an owner produced part that doesn't have any markings, or it's some other part that doesn't have any markings, then you either have to be able to demonstrate that it meets the OEM specifications, which is usually hard to do because the OEM specifications are typically not published. They're typically considered to be trade secrets of the manufacturer. Um, or else you have to reverse engineer the original failed part and be able to demonstrate that the new part, you know, has the same dimensions, is made of the same material, and it has the same heat treat and all that kind of stuff. And that often would involve getting a DER or somebody like that involved in doing the analysis. But you know, that at the end of the day, the requirement is to show that the part is airworthy.
I wonder if type clubs for some of these aircraft come into play here. Don't some type clubs maybe have some of that data from the original manufacturer that might be obtained through the type club in order to, you know, have that acceptable data and specification to do an owner produced part?
Yeah, if it's a manufacturer that's defunct, then sometimes that information winds up in the public domain. If it's a manufacturer like Cessna that's still very active, then it's highly unlikely that information is that the specs are available.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Cessna doesn't really want other people building their parts. But you know, if you think about PMA holders, let's say Superior Air Parts, okay, they make lots and lots and lots of parts for Continental engines and Lycoming engines and all sorts of other stuff. And I can guarantee you that Continental and Lycoming didn't give them the specs for building those parts. So they had to reverse engineer the parts. And then demonstrate to the FAA that their parts were at least as good as the OEM parts that they replace. So
Mm-hmm.
reverse engineering is perfectly legitimate, but you know, sometimes reverse engineering is not that easy because you need to figure out exactly what material the stuff's made out of, what the alloy is, what the heat treat is, and that's kind of thing that's above an A&P's pay grade. It's going to require a DER to do that.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we're talking all type certificated aircraft now. Experimental aircraft, they're not into this trap. I mean, an owner could fabricate their own part for their experimental aircraft, couldn't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
You'd want to have the data and make it like the manufacturer specified it, or the
Right.
plans developed.
All of us that own certificated aircraft wish we could re-register them as experimental.
Oh, I don't know. We can't use ours for compensation or hire, though. That's a pretty big
Well,
restriction.
I don't want to use my airplane for compensation or hire. I just want to fly it.
There you go. Yeah, there you go. Hey, Michael was wondering, as an AMP, or I should say, is an AMP allowed to produce parts themselves, or must the owner be involved in the production of the part to be in compliance with the regulation?
There is some regulatory language that allows mechanics to fabricate repair parts. However, that language is sufficiently restrictive that it makes it very, very hard for mechanics to do that. It requires that mechanics have an FAA approved quality assurance system in place or something. So it makes it very hard for a mechanic to casually produce it like a one-off part, like you need a new battery box or something like that. It's a lot easier to do it as an owner-produced part. But there is one other, if we're talking about this, there is one other interesting loophole, if you will, in the regulations. I don't know if loophole is the right word, but there's mechanics are allowed to repair things, and there's really no limitation on how extensive that repair can be. So let's say I needed a new oil line that goes from my turbocharger to my scavenge pump, and Cessna wants some ridiculous amount of money for it, and so I want to go out and get some tubing and a flaring tool and make one. Well, I can. There's two ways I can do that. I can do it as an owner produced part, and then I have to convince my mechanic to install it. Or I can say to the mechanic, let's repair this line. We're not going to replace the line. We're going to repair it. How are we going to repair it? Well, we're going to keep the old B nuts, but we're going to replace the tubing. And there's no part number for the tubing in the parts manual. That whole oil line assembly is a part, and it has some stainless steel tubing that with flares on the end, and it has B nuts to connect it to the things it connects to. So if we can salvage the original B nuts and only replace the tubing, we can call it a repair. We don't have to call it a replacement. And then it doesn't have to be an owner produced part. It's just a repaired line. And there's sort of a joking phrase among mechanics that I've heard called the golden rivet, which means, if you can salvage one rivet from the original part, you can call it a repair. But anyway, it's kind of an important concept to consider when you're dealing with things that are difficult or impossible to obtain. That you don't always have to call it a replacement. You can call it a repair if you can salvage any part of the original part that's defective, and then it becomes easy because mechanics are allowed to repair things. They're not really allowed to manufacture things unless they have some big quality assurance system in place.
So maybe a good time for Stephen's question. How difficult is it to use the field approval process to install similar parts?
Getting field approvals is getting harder and harder and harder. It used to be a lot easier, but it varied a lot from one FSDO to the next, and so people would wind up going FSDO shopping. They would want to get a field approval. Their local FSDO wasn't willing to give them one, so they'd find some other FSDO that was more liberal, and they get a field approval from that. And FAA headquarters didn't like this FSDO shopping stuff, so they decided to try to standardize the field approval process, and they sent out extensive guidance to the FSDOs saying, here's what you have to do on field approvals. And they provided a document called a job aid that lists a large number of different kinds of things that somebody might want to get a field approval on, and defines whether this is something that a FSDO, airworthiness safety inspector, is allowed to issue a field approval on his own recognizance, or whether he has to refer it to the aircraft certification office, the ACO, or whether it requires an STC and is not eligible for field approval. And this new guidance that came out, I don't know, probably 15 or 20 years ago, has made it much more difficult for FSDOs to issue field approvals. So we try to avoid the necessity of field approvals if we possibly can, because it's quite difficult.
John just says some early Cessna parts were purchased from GM or Ford. I found a window latch from Chevy parts that form, function, and fit was just like the Cessna window latch. So I'm guessing that some early parts are available from auto parts suppliers.
Yep. That reminds me of a funny story. I had a problem years ago with the de-icing system in my Cessna 310. There's when you cycle the boots on the 310, it goes through a sequence where it cycles the tail boots first, and then it cycles the wing boots. And there's a timer that does all of this. And when you're flying, you can look out and see the wing boots inflate, but you can't see the tail boots inflate. So they have a little idiot light on the panel that lights up when the tail boots inflate. And the idiot light is driven by a pressure switch that's mounted back in the tail, so that when the rear boots are pressurized, this pressure switch closes and turns on the idiot light. Well, my idiot light wasn't coming on when I cycled the boots, and I shot it back to the switch, the pressure switch, and the pressure switch was very, very corroded, and it was pretty apparent that it was inoperative and unsalvageable. So I went to the parts manual to look up the part for this thing and see if it was still available, and the parts manual said, well, that's not available. It says, WEU, when exhausted, use, and it gave a second part number. So I looked up that part number, and I got another WEU to a third part number. And the third part number was the only one that was currently available from Cessna. This was before the Cessna got rolled into Textron Aviation, and this little switch was, I forget, it's like $3,000 or something. And I thought, well, that's kind of ridiculous. I'm not going to spend $3,000 on this switch. And so I did some research. I called Goodyear, who actually manufactured the whole de-icing system, and I said, "What's with the $3,000 switch and all these part number changes and stuff?" And a guy that I talked to there, who apparently had worked there forever, knew the whole story about this switch, and he explained to me that the original switch that Cessna used, which was the switch that was installed in my airplane, was an automotive brake light switch that Cessna had repurposed for this purpose. But after a while, the manufacturer of this brake light switch got sued for something and said, we're not going to allow our switches to be used in airplanes anymore. So Cessna had to find another source for this switch. So they went to Hobbs, the guys that make the Hobbs meters, and they had a pressure switch that they used, for connecting to Hobbs meters so that the meter would run when there was oil pressure. And Cessna determined that this switch would work fine as an air pressure switch, so they started buying the switch from Hobbs. And then eventually Hobbs got sued and said, we don't want you using this switch anymore. So they had to go to some aerospace company to buy a pressure switch that was made for missiles or something, and that was the $3,000 switch. So I wound up finding one of the old automotive ones in a salvage yard, and it didn't have a part number sticker on it. So I carefully peeled the part number sticker off of my old corroded switch and pasted it on the other switch. I bench tested it, and it closed at the right pressure and everything. I installed it, and 25 years later, it's still working okay. But it was such a classic story of the kind of things that happen in aviation and why our parts prices are so ridiculous.
Yeah, good story. Thanks for sharing.
It's a very litigious business, and everybody, they don't like to get sued.
Dan wonders, or Dan says, I've been able to get information on the specs of minor Cessna parts from Cessna for some owner-produced parts I've made. Ask Cessna Engineering, you might get what you need.
Very cool. Well, that's good to know. Presumably there were parts that Cessna no longer makes and it's not interested in making anymore. That's probably why they made the data available. But that's really good that they were willing to share some of that stuff with you.
Now, we don't know if that engineer still works at Cessna or not. But,
that's true.
Okay, so on to the.
But if you don't ask, you don't get. So
that's right. Yeah, it doesn't. It's free to ask. So Gene wonders, is it normal for the insurance company to let an owner fabricate parts? Wouldn't they use that as an excuse not to honor a claim? And my insurance company wants a list of all modifications done to the aircraft since it was manufactured.
Well, first of all, in my experience, insurance companies almost never try to weasel out of a claim. That would be very, very unusual. Insurance companies are very vulnerable to bad faith lawsuits brought by clients who think that they're not being treated fairly, and they don't want to do that. So that's almost never a problem. Second of all, how would the insurance company even know? That you don't. If you're doing something to the airplane that you're worried that it might make the plane look bad, then you probably are not going to describe it in great detail in the maintenance records. The FAR 43.9 says that the maintenance record has to include a description of the work performed, but it doesn't say anything about how detailed or lengthy or anything that description is. So, if you're doing something questionable, you probably want to make the description as minimalistic as possible, and not make people curious about what you're doing. When the insurance company is asking for a list of modifications made to the aircraft, I'm sure that the only modifications they're interested in, or that they're even entitled to, are major alterations, ones that where you filed a Form 337. It would be very, very difficult to assemble a list of every minor alteration that was ever made to an aircraft, especially if it's 50 years old. And I can't imagine that the insurance company be interested in that. But they're probably interested in a list of all major alterations. If you had a horsepower increase, or a stall kit installed, or anything else that is considered a major alteration and has a Form 337 on file, then they may want to know that.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mike, let's wrap it up here. Looks like we had a great turnout tonight, probably around 900 people. That's kind of what I saw on the counter here. Yeah, it was great. So take a moment and share closing thoughts with us.
Okay. This has sort of been a kind of a rambling presentation, but it's interesting. We've had some really interesting questions. Mm-hmm. Anyway, just the usual stuff. If you want to get on my email list, the easiest way to do that is to text the word SAVVY, SAVVY, to 33777, and we send out usually a couple of emails a month, a monthly newsletter, and some other stuff. I know we're about to send out something about the SAVVY Borescope initiative sometime in the next week or two. So if you want to get on the list, that's the easiest way to do it. My 4 books are available at the EAA bookstore. Aircraft Spruce has them. You can order them on Amazon, and they're all 4 now available in audiobook form. We just submitted finally the audiobook version of Ownership Volume 2 to Audible, so it should be listed sometime in the next week or so. It should be available on Audible. Or the podcast that I do with my colleagues, Paul New and Colleen Sterling, called Ask the A&Ps, is now a twice a month podcast. We did a couple of live podcast sessions at AirVenture. The one we did on Tuesday, I think, set a record for the maximum number of people that got stuffed into the AOPA venue there on the flight line. It was a great session, but we do this twice a month, and it's a kind of a call-in show. So if you want to participate with some kind of a maintenance stumper question for us to try to deal with, you can email your questions to podcast@aopa.org, and our wonderful producer Ian Twombly will get you scheduled for one of our upcoming recording sessions. And then the next 3 webinars I'll be doing, first Wednesday of each month, the September webinar called "Can't Sign It Off," talks about a story of an aircraft that we had that got stuck in a shop for a period of months because they were unwilling to sign the aircraft off, and we'll get into the legalities of how that all works out. October webinar is entitled "Why Annual Inspections," and it's a webinar in which I sort of question whether it really makes sense for us to have to take our airplanes completely apart for inspection every year, or whether there are some things that could go a couple of years and so on. And I talk about the regulations and the fact that larger aircraft like King Airs and Citations and stuff don't have to do annual inspections. They do phased inspections, which makes a lot more sense. But us little guys have to do annual inspections. And so I talk about the discrepancy there and what changes the FAA would need to make in order for us to be able to do things more like the big guys are allowed to do. And then November 6th is called Distrust and Verify. And it's a webinar about mechanics that take owners' squawks too literally and go off on wild goose chases where they're missing what's wrong with the airplane completely because they haven't really tried to reproduce the problem. And there's a couple of interesting stories there that I think provide some lessons learned as to how aircraft owners need to interface with their mechanics when they're squawking a problem. And that's all I have for tonight, Tim. I'm glad to hear that we had a really good turnout, and I'm looking forward to seeing you guys in September.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. Great presentation, and looking forward to seeing you in September as well. And to everybody who tuned in tonight, thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Good night, everybody.